Today I'm answering some of the questions that I most commonly get about winter sowing, and I'm going to show you what I do when it's time to up-pot tiny babies, as well as transplant plants out into the garden. Let's go. Hey friends, it's Kendall, your joyful farmer. Today I'm going to answer some of the most frequently asked questions that I get about winter sowing. I'm also going to walk you through step-by-step of how I up-pot tiny babies, when and why I do that, and when it's time to transplant them out into the garden, how I do that as well. Winter sowing is the process of starting seeds in vented, greenhouse-style containers outdoors during the winter months. I have 2 other informative videos about winter sowing, and I'll link those videos in the description below this video. If you're not familiar with winter sowing, I would recommend that you watch those videos first. The question that I get most commonly about winter sowing is, can I winter sow in my zone? Or can winter sowing be done in blank? And the answer is most likely yes. You can winter sow anywhere that you experience seasons. Winter sowing works with the natural rhythms of your climate and your seasons to start seeds and grow plants. So as long as you have a winter where the day length is shorter and the temperatures are colder than the rest of the year, you have a period of time in which you can winter sow. The seeds themselves are not going to germinate until the conditions are right for them. For example, here in my warmer climate with our fluctuating winter temperatures here in North Texas, many of my winter sown seeds are going to germinate sooner for me than they would for those of you who are in cooler climates. But your specific location is going to help determine the plants that you can successfully winter sow and successfully grow. Something to think about is that if your winter temperatures never get lower than 50 degrees, those seeds that need cold stratification to germinate might struggle to germinate or not germinate at all. You might see a very low germination rate on them. If you live near the equator and you don't have a winter season, you're not going to be able to winter sow in the classic sense. However, you might still find it beneficial to start seeds in vented greenhouse-style containers to protect them from being eaten by critters. The next question I get is, which seeds can I start in my climate? This is where it helps to understand the characteristics of your specific growing season and what to look for when browsing for seeds. You can sow natives, perennials, and annuals that are either cold hardy, half hardy, or frost tender annuals. Any of those seeds you can winter sow. The only group of seeds that you can't winter sow are tropical seeds, and with tropical seeds, the seed itself can't survive freezing temperatures. Cool hardy annuals and perennials are the ones that benefit the most from being winter sown. A good rule of thumb is that if the plant is frost hardy, it will do well to be started with winter sowing. Just look at the back of a seed packet to check to see if they're frost hardy. You'll also always be safe to winter sow plants that are native to your specific area. You can do a web search for plants native to your area, and you'll have a list of natives that will do just fine being winter sown. Some great resources for you in finding those seeds that are going to be really great to grow in your area are going to be your local ag extension office. They are a great resource that's really knowledgeable about your specific growing area, and you can check the local nursery and ask the staff there that are knowledgeable about plants that are grown in your area. Good nurseries are going to be ordering good native and non-native plants that are going to thrive for their customers. Where some seeds may not work for your climate winter sown is tender annuals. If you live in a climate where you have a short frost-free growing season, it's going to limit the tender annuals that you can grow successfully. You need to look at the days to maturity of the variety that you're trying to grow. Typically, days to maturity refers to the number of days from when the plant is transplanted out to when the plant is mature and producing fruit or blooms in the garden. For example, if your frost-free growing season is 80 days long and you are growing a tomato variety that's 90 days to maturity, you're most likely not going to be able to successfully winter sow that in order to get a harvest in the same year. Peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants are the frost tender annuals that have longer days to maturity, and those are the ones that you typically have to watch out for the most. Also, if you live in a location where you have a hot summer and a short spring, like we do here in North Texas, those tender fruiting annuals that have higher days to maturity may not work well for you either, because extreme heat, like 95 degrees Fahrenheit and above or 35 degrees Celsius and above, will stop some of those plants from producing. So your production window might be too short to winter sow some of those as well. Ultimately, I don't just take anyone's word for it that something will or will not work for me and my climate and my specific growing conditions. My advice is to not be afraid to learn through experience. We learn so much more about what will specifically work for us and our situation if we just test things out for ourselves and are not afraid of trial and error. The next question I get is, how do I sow the seeds? With winter sowing, we follow the recommended guidelines on seed packets for sowing depth. There are no official spacing guidelines for winter sowing as far as how many seeds to put in a container, but I personally don't like to dump a whole packet of seeds into a container. I aim for maybe 12 to 30 plants in a milk jug if they're smaller seeds, and I like to give the faster, more quickly growing plants like borage, artichoke, or lupins more space in containers, more like 4 to 5 in a milk jug. If I find a container is really crowded, I'll sometimes move out some of the seedlings into a new container to give them more space as they're growing. I found some awesome rubber-tipped tweezers that work really well for that purpose when the seeds and the roots are both still pretty tiny. The next question is snow and icy weather okay? Yes, it is actually expected that there will be snow and ice, and it's actually beneficial for your cool-loving seeds that need cold stratification to get good germination. The natural precipitation is also really good for the containers. It keeps the containers moist and keeps the environment right for the seeds to germinate. The only time that I start to worry about ice or snow is if I have some baby plants that are not as cold hardy as others and they've already sprouted due to our fluctuating temperatures in the winter. If I'm worried about plants not making it through extreme cold, I'll sometimes cover them overnight to give them extra protection. If the temperatures are really extreme and really cold for the plants, yes, I will bring those containers inside at night, which some winter sowing purists might not appreciate. Before I go any further, if you're finding value in this content, I would really appreciate it if you'd consider giving the video a like or subscribing or sharing it with someone. And all of those go a really long way to helping us grow our channel and helping more people to find joy in growing. The next question is, when should I open my containers? At the bare minimum, I will open my containers a week before I plant them out, when the seedlings get to transplant size with 2 sets of true leaves. This way they have a week to acclimate to the wind and the sun directly outside. A good idea is to place a container in the actual space that you'll be planting the plant so that it can adapt to that specific location while the container's open. Some people like to open their containers after tiny seedlings emerge. They like to open them on warmer days to start exposing them to wind. And then they'll reseal them again when the temperatures get cooler at night. I tend to wait to open containers until there's no risk of freezing temperatures at night, just so I don't have to worry about opening and closing and resealing them. I prefer not to have to open and close containers constantly if I can help it. But if you have fluctuating temperatures and there's a warm spell, it really is best to address that. On sunny days where the temperature gets above 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius, I would recommend either opening the containers or putting them in the shade to keep baby plants from overheating. Look who showed up today. I missed you, Luke. The next question is, what if plants grow too fast and my ground is still frozen outside? We don't tend to have this problem in North Texas because it's, as you can see, it's February and I think the high is about 78 degrees today. But if your plants are the right size to transplant and the ground is still frozen outside, it's really no problem. But you'll want to up pot your baby plants and give them more space to grow. I like to give each plant at least a 2-inch cube of soil space if I need them to hold on longer in the container before I transplant them. Yogurt containers work well for this, 3-inch or 4-inch pots, or I love using 2-inch soil blocks. They work really well for up potting. Look how good that guy looks. He's got more than 2 true leaves, but he's perfectly happy in this 2-inch soil block and continuing to grow a little bit longer and hold on for me. Another thing you can do is you can just remove some of the plants and then leave some room for plants to grow in the original container. So like for example, I've got this lemon mint here. Some of these are super crowded, but some of them have plenty of space. If I wanted to, I could grab a whole hunk of these guys, separate them, and up pot them into separate containers, and that would give what's left more room for the roots to grow. I've actually already removed some plants from this and up potted them, but there is still a lot of crowding going on. But this is also a fine time to transplant them. They have 2 sets of true leaves, so it's about time to do something with them. Another thing you can do is you can just thin plants by clipping some and leaving enough plants in the container so that they have enough space to continue growing. Like I said, at least 2 inches of a cube worth of space is good for plants to continue growing past that recommended transplant size. If I were to do this with this container, I would probably leave, maybe 10 in the container so that they each have 1 to 2 inches of space all the way around each plant. Leia, what are you doing? Leia, you're in my spot. The next question I get is, when do I sow certain seeds, or is there a winter sowing calendar? Now, Trudy, who is the original creator of winter sowing, insists that there's no official calendar for winter sowing as long as you're sowing the seeds during the winter. Some seeds do need a cold period or cold stratification to germinate well. So if you wait until the end of winter to start those seeds, you might miss out on that cold period for those seeds that need it. Other seeds like tender annuals don't need a cold period, and there's really no benefit to starting them at the beginning of winter. It can actually also prove to be a disadvantage for your tender annuals because with a warm spell in the winter, they may actually germinate before your last frost date, and a frost or freeze will come in and it'll cause you to lose some plants. The simplest guideline I go by to set my seeds up for success is that if a plant is frost tolerant or cold hardy or a perennial in my area, it's one that I prioritize to sow earlier in the winter season. And if it's a tender annual or a heat loving plant, I won't worry about starting it until 6 weeks before my estimated last frost date. If you want an actual calendar for winter sowing, you could actually get any indoor seed starting calendar, and as a rule of thumb, I would look for the recommended start date for the seeds and bump it back 3 to 4 weeks, starting all of the seeds a little bit earlier than it's recommended to when starting them indoors. This gives the winter sown seeds extra time for cold stratification, and it gives time for that slower germination that just naturally happens with winter sown seeds. The next question is, how do I remove plants from containers, and how do I up pot or transplant plants? I have a couple of different approaches that I'm going to show you depending on how crowded the plants are or how tangled the roots are. To determine when it's time to up pot my baby plants, I'll look at them and check to see how many true leaves they have. If they have at least 2 sets of true leaves, that means that they're technically ready to be planted out into the garden. But if I need them to hold on because it's not quite their time, the temperatures aren't quite right for them to be planted out, I'll go ahead and I'll give them their own space. So I'll either do this by separating all the plants and giving each one their own new area of soil, or like I said, I will thin some in the container and lose a few of them by clipping them with scissors or just pinching them off with my fingers. Or I'll pull some of the plants out of the container and give them their own space while leaving some in the original container with space as well. If they have some space between them and the root systems are still easy to separate, I will use a fork or the rubber tipped tweezers or I will use just my forefinger and my thumb to gently pull a plant out, and I'll just reach as far as I can to get as much of the root system as possible, and then gently tease it to separate the plant. This I'll do if there's more space in the containers and I did a better job spacing out my plants in the containers. And then when I'm up potting, I like to either use 4-inch pots or soil blocks depending on the size of the plant babies. If the babies are still on the tiny side, but they do have 2 true leaves, I like to up pot them into 2-inch soil blocks. I'll use the long dibble attachment, and as long as the root system fits down into the little hole left by the dibble, I consider it a good candidate for soil blocking. If the root system is larger and it won't fit in the little dibble hole, I will separate them and give them each their own 3 to 4-inch pot. With this container, what I probably would do is go ahead and remove the largest plants and get as many of the roots as possible and leave a few of these babies, maybe 3 or 4 in this container to keep growing. I do not need this many summer savory plants. I really probably only need 1, and I'll probably share a few with friends. So if I have to pinch and get rid of some plants just to leave them more space and buy them some more time, that's what I'll do. If I had a choice, I would probably up pot as many babies as I could into 2-inch soil blocks when I'm trying to buy time, because they do such a nice job growing in the soil blocks because the roots have more access to air, and you get a lot less transplant shock when you go to plant them out in the garden. Now let's say it's time to transplant out. In this current moment, it's actually a great time for me to plant out any of my cold hardy plants because we are about 4 weeks out from our average estimated last frost date. But when I'm ready to transplant out, I will check the weather to make sure that there's not a severe cold front expected within the next week. And then I'll get my containers open and I will get my plants hardened off. So I'll preferably set them in place where they'll be transplanted, and I'll open that container and just let the wind and sun do its job. I turn the container on its side and upside down, and I'll kind of shimmy it out. Then you can do a couple of different things. You can cut or break the big giant mass of plants into separate hunks of seedlings and just break them into brownie sized squares. That's Trudy's favorite method. Or she'll even just cut them, kind of do a tic-tac-toe method of cutting them and then have these brownies to just plant out. Or if you want to be careful to separate plant roots and plant babies individually, I recommend putting them in a shallow tub of 3 to 4 inches of water, and I'll shake the soil out into the water, and while the roots are underwater, I'll continue to shake the roots, and I'll gently tease apart the plants while those roots are still underwater. I've found that the water makes it a lot easier to separate tangled roots. And I'll make sure that they're well watered in when I get those roots underground. When I go to transplant or up pot, I'll also note that I make sure that I am transplanting or up potting with the soil level at the same line that it was whenever I pulled them from their original container. Unless it's a plant that has adventitious roots, which are roots that will grow from the stem, which are things like tomatoes, ground cherries, tomatillos, things like that. Those I'll usually bury the stem a little bit further when I'm transplanting or up potting so that they'll grow additional roots from the stem underground. But after they're transplanted out in the garden, they normally do really, really well because they're such hardy plants. And last but not least, my favorite question that I think everybody should be asking is, what if I end up with too many plants? And this is a great question because it inevitably happens every year that I winter sow. And my favorite answer is to share them with friends. Or of course, you can build more garden space. Who doesn't need an excuse to build more garden space, right? So that's the end of my list of questions. Are there any questions that you have about winter sowing, or is there any winter sowing wisdom that you would like to share? Please let me know in the comments below, and I'll also try and respond because I really do love to hear from you. I wish you joy, and I'll see you next time.